Now, it's just over 15 years since the man who brought us Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick and Reasons to Be Cheerful passed away. In this programme, first broadcast in 2003, comedian Linda Smith chose singer-songwriter Ian Dury as her choice of a life well lived. Here's Humphrey Carpenter with Great Lives.
Hello. It was in 1979 that this was number one in the charts, and it was hard to say which seemed more odd, the song or the singer.
In the wilds of Borneo and the vineyards of Bordeaux, Eskimo, Arapaho move their body to and fro. Hit me with your rhythm stick, hit me. Das ist gut, say, fantastic. Hit me, hit me, hit me.
The unmistakable voice of singer-songwriter Ian Dury. Actually, I'm not sure about singer. Even a quarter of a century later, that extraordinary voice retains the power to shake up your expectations of what a pop single should be. Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick is one of a bundle of extraordinary songs with lyrics by Dury, which he delivered in that barrow boy voice fronting his band, the Blockheads. Ian Dury was born in 1942 and died 3 years ago. He was also a painter, an art teacher, an actor, a TV presenter, and an ambassador to UNICEF. And today he's the choice of my guest in the Great Live studio. She's somebody who's thoroughly used to neither deviating, hesitating or repeating herself. Yeah, she's a regular on Radio 4's Just a Minute. You can also hear her on the News Quiz. She's been voted winner of the Hackney Empire New London Comic Award, and listeners to Word of Mouth on this network recently decided she was no less than the wittiest living person. Gosh, what a build-up, but it's no more than is deserved by Linda Smith. Linda, welcome to Great Lives, and what has led you to choose the gravel-voiced Mr. Dury?
Oh, well, actually, I'd argue with gravel-voiced. I don't think he's gravel-voiced. I think Tom Waits is gravel-voiced. Ian Dury's, I don't know, it's a sort of rum and raisin flavour voice, isn't it? It's a rich and fruity and cheeky and ironic. It's more than gravel, I reckon.
When he was ill with cancer in 1999, somebody asked Ian Dury how he wanted to be remembered, and he said, "I don't want to be remembered, I'm only here for now." Is that an attitude that appeals to you?
Well, it's a very sensible attitude, it's a pragmatic attitude, because once you're dead, it doesn't really matter how you're remembered, does it? But, of course, he is remembered.
He did also say in one of his song lyrics, "The only birthday present I want is another birthday." He did love life, didn't he?
He did love life. And I think in terms of this sort of remembering thing, I think one of his later lyrics from Mr. Lovepants, his last work, just sums it up really. When it comes to mortal coil, we leave behind a counterfoil of what we did and who we knew, and that's what makes the story true.
He was rare in that he brought comedy into the world of rock music, which usually I think takes itself rather seriously. Have his songs had any influence on your own brand of comedy, Linda?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Not influence on my own brand of comedy, but they represent something I love, which is that cleverness with words, that sort of proletarian poetry, really, the way ordinary people use language in a way that's funny or savage or you know, vicious, or just in that very creative, inventive way. In the way that sort of Tennessee Williams did with the ordinary people of the Deep South of America. He took that and made something sort of wonderful from it. And if there's any element of that in the way I use language, I'd be very happy.
You say proletarian. His voice does, I think, raise suspicions that he might have been Mockney rather than true Cockney, but this is where we should be queuing in our expert, and there's nobody more expert on Ian Dury than Charlie Gillett. Charlie worked closely with him and indeed helped to discover him. Charlie, welcome to Great Lives. We'll come to your own role in Ian's life in a few minutes, but first, the basics. Where was he born?
It's true that he kind of invented himself. In other words, wherever he was born of what would be called a middle-class mother, because she was a teacher, and we all know teachers are middle-class.
He said he was conceived at the back of the Ritz and born at the height of the Blitz.
That's just a good wordsmith. His father was more of a kind of chancer. That's not quite right. Anyway, he did have a choice of alternatives as to which way to go, in a sense of which parent to follow more. I think he just wanted to communicate, and in England more than anywhere else, and I say England now, I'm not including Wales and Scotland, which is another game, we are incredibly sensitive to accents and where we pitch ourselves verbally. We define who we want to call our peers, who we consider ourselves to be better than, and who we consider ourselves to be lower than.
Linda's nodding wildly.
Absolutely
And
agree
Ian,
with that.
and that's the game that Ian played.
And as Charlie said, Ian's mother was middle class, a doctor's daughter, and spoke posh. Ian opted for his father. But in this interview from 1986, he admits he's actually seen very little of his dad over the years, both as a child and an adult. But he clearly thought a great deal of him.
My dad was a good geezer, I suppose. Before the war, he was a bus driver. And he met my mum, and she was a university person who'd got, what do they call it? Sent down. I think they parted up in their ways. But he was a chauffeur, which seems to me a contradiction in some sort of way or other. But he was settled, and he had this little place and a big wardrobe in there.
My old man was fairly handsome. He smoked too many cigs. Lived in one room in Victoria. He was tidy in his digs. Had to have an operation when his ulcer got too big. When his ulcer got too big. My old man.
I didn't see very much of my old man. Well, I mean, I was in hospital for a long time anyway, and away and that. And then I did see him when I was 17 for the first time for a long time. I had a chat with him. He said, "What's all them sideboards you got there?" I went, "Well, sideboards, Dad, like, you know," shrugging the old, what's names and things. And so he bought me an electric razor, which I sold for 30 bob. So I didn't see him again for another 7 years. And then I saw him when I had an exhibition at the ICA Gallery when it used to be in Dover Street in 1967. A lot of pictures of pin-ups and gangsters. And he came. I saw the chauffeurs out in the front of his Mercedes. So I got to know him again. Like I could be level with him, you know. I ain't a wastrel, really, Dad. I only look like a wastrel. He thought I was a wastrel more than my mum did, really. My mum would be like in a clinic, you know, she was a health visitor, and people would come up and say, "Mrs. Dury, is your son a tramp?" Like that, because I had all long hair and that, you know.
Ian Dury on his father. Linda Smith, where do you come in the English class structure, and how much does it matter to you?
Well, I'm very definitely working class, and in terms of mattering to me, well, it's part of who you are, and I don't think it changes. It annoys me if people describe me as middle class, if that ever happened. It does definitely annoy me, just because it's wrong. And because there's often, I think there's a perception that if you can string a few words together, you must be middle class, and that's annoying.
How much is the class issue a source of your comedy?
Oh, it definitely is a source, because, as Charlie's been saying, it's such a preoccupation in this country, specifically in England. It's such a preoccupation, and so much. You look at, much comedy of recent times, Fawlty Towers. It's all about his middle-class pretensions and, porridge, what could be a more, sort of underclass than people in prison. We are obsessed with it, and it colours a lot of our behaviour and attitudes.
Well, this is Ian Dury with one of the stock class jokes of our time, Essex Man.
Good evening, I'm from Essex, in case you couldn't tell. My given name is Dickie. I come from Billericay, and I'm doing very well.
Had a love affair with Nina in the back of my Cortina. A seasoned up hyena could not have been more obscene.
You can really see Billericay Dickie, you can see Clever Trevor, you can see Joyce and Vicky. It's a kind of a Dickensian sort of talent, really, to evoke these great colourful characters. And the language thing, it's just perfect, it's brilliant. You can't listen to that without smiling. It's fantastic.
I'm not a blinking thickie, I'm Billericay Dickie, and I'm doing very well.
The sense of place, that's another thing, that geography, as well as class, because you can come from Essex and sound like Ian Dury and be middle class, because it's a geographical thing and it's an attitude and it's a way of being, and it's kind of more fun to speak like that. It's more fun to say Skellington instead of skeleton. It's more fun to say ambulance instead of ambulance. It's just playfulness is what it is.
Oh golly, oh gosh, come and lie on the couch with a nice bit of posh from Burnham on Crouch.
I'd like to use this programme to spearhead my campaign to get Ian Dury lyrics taken up in the Essex towns. I was in Burnham on Crouch a while ago, and I thought, wouldn't it be nice to see on a pavement, like Hull has that fish pavement, on a pavement or on a wall or somewhere, just little bits from, oh golly, oh gosh, come and lie on the couch with a nice bit of posh from Burnham on Crouch. And I'm calling the civic great and the good of Burnham and Crouch to be bold enough to initiate this. Everywhere, the Isle of Thanet, anywhere mentioned in Ian Dury should have somewhere about the town little snippets of lyrics that you can find.
What a wonderful idea.
I'd rendezvous with Jenny, quite near the Isle of Thanet. She looked more like a Ganny. She was an art apprentice.
Do you prefer those comic portrait songs to the lyrical ones like Wake Up and Make Love With Me?
Well, I love them all. I mean, Sweet Jean Vincent, I adore, but there is something in those sort of really scurrilous, those low-life scenarios that are very appealing, really.
When I was 15, I wore a black draped jacket, sideboards to my chin. I used to ride around in a two-tone Zephyr with a mean and nasty grin. When I heard that, I thought, oh my God, you know, and that was from his earlier days with Kilburn and the High Roads.
Wonderful, wonderful. Should I mourn your decline with some Thunderbird wine and a black handkerchief?
And a black handkerchief. I miss your sad Virginia whisper. I miss the voice that called my heart. Sweet Jean Vincent.
In childhood, Ian Dury got polio. It happened when he was 7, and he may have contracted it at a public swimming pool in Southend.
I just woke up, or got up one day and had like a flu. And I lay down on a couch, and the next thing I remember was being in an ambulance. And then I remember being in a kind of hazy, nightmare, fevery world for about 6 weeks. My mum told me she got a phone call in the middle of the night, I think it was, quite late. The first train she could get on was a milk train. And they let her come outside, it was in a Nissen hut type of hospital. They let her come and have her last look through the window, because they didn't think I was going to make it. And they turned the bedside light on by my bed, there's a little white face on the pillow. But I was still there in the morning, because I'm a goer. I remember being in plaster for ages, 6 months. I was in, for the first 6 weeks, I remember being in a whole body of plaster. That stops you because polio pulls your muscles around and it can pull you right out of shape. So they put you in a plaster shell to hold you in shape and then bandage you. And I remember being in that for quite a long time. I remember that, you know, there are restrictions, but it's a little bit like the jolly up that you get in a prison camp. You're finding things to do all the time so that you don't ever suffer. And you can't suffer because you're in beds with people who are much worse than that.
Well, Ian Dury was left with a bad limp and a caliper, but Charlie Gillett, it sounds as if he really did just get on with life and didn't indulge in self-pity at all.
No, self-pity didn't come into it. Because he was distinctive. It's a terrible thing to be when you're a teenager, is to be distinctive, because people pick you out and exploit whatever it is that they can see as weak about you. Words were his weapon, that he could use them to charm, but he could use them to destroy. If he just looked at you and just said a certain kind of thing, you could feel really terrible. So I'm sure that
he was quite formidable, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. And I think he learned that as a teenager.
I mean, the confidence of the man is so impressive to then decide, well, I'm going to be a pop star. When I first saw Ian Dury on TV, I was struck by how attractive he was. He was very sexy. And I think probably the first Raspberry Ripple since Lord Byron to be a sex symbol. Extraordinary.
Well, you mentioned Byron. I mean, they both had this limp, didn't they? Because Byron had a club foot.
He was Byronic.
I come awake with the gift for womankind. You're still asleep, but the gift don't seem to mind. Rise on this occasion, halfway up your back, sliding down your body, touching your behind.
Ian Dury and the Blockheads with the song that he always began each gig with. Ian had a grammar school education in High Wycombe, rather surprisingly. I suppose that's when he began to develop a real facility with words. One of his songs mentions Noel Coward, respectfully, and he himself, I think, had a lyric writing talent which is really equal to Noel Coward's. Fantastic.
What a wonderful line. Noel Coward, what a charmer. As a writer, he was Brahma.
Ian, he went to Wycombe, and he himself went to art school, but he was, I don't know, all wherever he was, wherever you try to pin him down, he is in the past. He's liking Max Wall and the famous music hall comedians. They were part of his culture.
I mean, the comic songs are very much out of that background, aren't they?
But I think people often overemphasise that and kind of, in the past people have sort of written him off as the sort of cheeky chappy, musical artist. They're all, as you said, they're all kind of other much more complicated, enriched things in that mix. And punk, of course, we mustn't forget that. The whole punk sort of sensibility was a huge part of what made it possible.
Ian just pushed everything to the limit. Whatever situation you're talking about, he went to the limit. He was not explorer is a wrong word. He was sort of fearless. I mean, all of us have fear. He had fear, but he was prepared to deal with the fear and find out what happened if you did this. And most of the songs that we've just played have all got lyrics that are either literally or on the edge of things you don't put in songs and expect to get played on the radio. He pushed that. He explored how far you could go.
Now, he talks here about his approach to writing lyrics. It's not as if he was a tub thumper preaching to his audience, but it's clear that he had got some points to get across.
Well, all the lyrics I write, which is probably the only way I can imagine having an influence on anybody, are trying, not all the lyrics, some of them are mere entertainments, but they try and ask questions in the same language that the people who I want to listen to the music would use. I could be a driver and articulated lorry. I could be a poet and I wouldn't need to worry, which is a joke that lorry don't rhyme with worry. I could be a sergeant in a squadron full of wallers. I could be a teacher in a classroom full of scholars. What a waste. What a waste.
What a waste. Because I chose to play the fool in a six-piece band. First night nerves, every one night stand. I should be glad to be so inclined. What a waste, what a waste. Rock and roll don't waste.
The question's there in that song if you want to ask it or if you want to recognise it. But I'm not going to shove it at anybody. In that particular song, the question is, are you what you want to be? Simple as that.
I could be a writer with a growing reputation. I could be the ticket man at Fulham railway station. What a waste. What a waste.
The time that I knew Ian best was before this, back in the early 70s, when his band was called Kilburn and the High Roads, which included a couple of his students. He was an art teacher still at Canterbury. He'd just turned 30, extremely doubtful that you could start a career in pop music as old as 31 as he was. And the band was a mixture of free jazz musicians. 2 or 3 of them had literally played, anarchic-sounding, wild, extreme, and Davy Payne, the saxophone player, was one of those. And then more restricted musicians who really didn't know many more than the 3 chords they were playing. And so it was a very weird combination. The drummer was himself physically impaired, so that was a bizarre idea to have a drummer who was requiring this coordination of limbs to be, not have all of his limbs available to himself, in effect. We managed miraculously to find a big company to make an album with him, Warner Brothers, who flew over their American boss to see this group who was this going to be something for America. And the story is that Joe Smith lasted 3 songs and turned away and came away. Are you kidding? Not a chance for America to kill them in the High Roads. And Ian Dury never did. The whole Stiff label, we haven't actually mentioned Stiff, but it's important to do this. This was an independent company which had been started about 1976 with Elvis Costello as one of their first artists, and Ian came along very soon after. And they created this idea of maverick performers who didn't play to the rules. And they banged on the door of Radio 1, who were not particularly sympathetic to this at first. And in fact, Ian's first single was Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll, which everybody knows, but wasn't played on the radio. That was, just wasn't.
No plays, let alone not becoming number 1.
No, not plays at all. Yeah. So Stiff it was important to be part of Stiff, but Ian was the pinnacle of it. And Madness came along on Stiff afterwards, and Madness had made 15, 20 top 10 records. I mean, incredible number of top 10 records. Very much the spirit of Ian. They had the discipline and whatever it took to keep coming up with the ideas, which we haven't, so far made any critical comments of this man. He didn't really follow up that early success. When you look at the period, he was really only popular for about 18 months, in fact. And, I mean, like so many people, he started to think that whatever he did was going to be magical, and it isn't like that. You have to keep crafting it all the way down the line.
Linda, at what point did you pick up on Ian Dury? When did you begin to notice him, first of all?
Oh, I would have been at school, I suppose, sort of 6th form, I suppose, when I think about it.
Give us a date.
I'm hopeless with time, I'm afraid. But I remember it very clearly, seeing him on television, and then I remember after that seeking out the Stiff live shows and going to one of those. Great shows with him and Reckless Eric, and just this wonderful... They were just fantastic. They were like nothing you'd ever seen before. It was just a moment of sheer joy, really.
Reasons to be cheerful, part 3. 1, 2, 3. Summer Buddy Holly, the working folly, good golly Miss Molly, and boats. Hammersmith Pally, the Bolshoi Bally, jump back in the alley, add nanny goats. 18-wheeler camels, Dominica camels, all other mammals plus equal votes. Seeing Piccadilly, Fanny Smith and Willie, being rather silly, and porridge oats. I better grin and bear it, I better come and share it. You're welcome, we can spare it. Yellow socks, too short to be haughty, too nutty to be naughty. Going on.
This is Great Lives. Linda Smith has chosen to celebrate Ian Dury, and Charlie Gillett is recalling him for us.
Reasons to be cheerful. 1, 2, 3.
Incidentally, Charlie, why were they called the Blockheads?
I wasn't party to that. I don't know. It was very appropriate. I really don't know. But I'm glad you've mentioned them. Linda said, how did he have the confidence to get on stage? Ian didn't have confidence. He was extremely doubtful that this was ever going to work. He was very aware that he didn't have a great voice by any standards. But the combination of his almost speaking voice and then these brilliant, brilliant musicians, and Chas Jankel was the keyboard player who kind of brought this new formula of music together. And it was dance music of a new kind that wasn't being made in Britain by anybody else. So they were musical innovators as much as he was a lyrical innovator. And it's really important to get both sides of this across.
Blue Jean
Absolutely agree with that. Because yes, Ian Dury went a sort of Rex Harrison way with his singing, with this brilliant interpretive power and very attractive sort of whispering voice. But the band were and are fantastic, the Blockheads. I think they probably see themselves as a jazz ensemble, really, aren't they? They're very jazz-influenced sound.
But never jazz as such. I mean, funny enough,
a mix of that and art school and pop and rock, a whole sort of melange. And as you say, a completely new kind of pop music. Wonderful, so tight, such a tight band. And Chas Jankel, rightly you mentioned, so many wonderful keyboard ideas. Always those exciting intros. Just the minute you hear them, you know it's them. It's just so distinctive.
Sweet Jean Vincent, young and old and gone. Sweet Jean Vincent.
The most magical thing of all was Chas Jankel, the keyboard player. He went to Maurice Plaquet, which is a place where you hire keyboards from. As he was leaving, he just said, by the way, I'm looking for a band to play in, so if you hear anything. And they said, give us your number. So he wrote his name and number, and they called him up, and we said, we've heard about this band, they're looking for a keyboard player. So he said he went down to the Nashville, which was where this band was playing, and this was a late version of Ian, I think he was called Ian Dury and the Kilburns by now. And he watched the band, he thought, he'd never heard them before, thought they were fantastic, knocked on the door. The door opened, and Ian, in the dressing room, holding court, gives Chas one of those looks. What you doing here? And Chas apologetically sort of, I heard about, get out of here. And luckily, somebody else in the room said, no, I know this is... And they brought him in, and this was. So when I talked to Chas, I said, well, at least you found out very early what you were in for. He said, yeah, I knew what I was in for.
Linda Smith, you're in a different branch of the performing arts, but has a manager ever been important to you, or do you regard them as necessary evils?
No, it's very, very different, I must say, to rock music. No, I've never had that kind of... experience at all.
Your managers just manage and
they
book
function
dates.
more or less as a call centre.
There's a lot of rock musicians would say the same about their managers.
Touring is a famous way of bringing bands' lives to an end. That just wears them down. That's not true with solo comedians, presumably, Linda. You like travel and being on the road?
I do, but, it's not quite the same. I'm going to Eastbourne tomorrow, for example. It's not quite the same as a world tour with a rock band.
In a beat-up old automobile or something?
Oh, no, in a nice car, and we'll have a cup of tea on the way. It's quite a different experience, really, the tour. I mean, when you first start out, it's the same as bands starting out, when you're staying in terrible bed and breakfasts and touring in old transit vans. That's exactly the same, whatever you're doing. I've stayed in hotels where it's been so grim and miserable and cold that in the night I've had to get up, get dressed and put my coat on the bed. I remember in the morning saying to this man, the manager, when he said, do you sleep all right? And I thought, no, I'm not going to do that English thing and say, oh, fine. I'd say, well, actually, no. It was so freezing and miserable. I had to get fully dressed, have a cup of tea just to get my circulation going and put my coat on the bed. And he said, you should be here in January.
Good old Basil. Charlie Gillett, the big album success for Ian Dury and the Blockheads was the late 70s album New Boots and Panties. And that allegedly led to him being asked to write lyrics for Andrew Lloyd Webber. Is that true, that story?
It's possible, because he was such a good lyric writer. I can't think that he considered it for longer than a very short second, because he would have known that that wasn't the idiom for him, which was going to make his songs feel right. He did later on write a thing called Apples, which was a musical and which was actually really good, and in which he appeared as a performer. So it's not that he didn't admire the musical form, it's just Andrew Lloyd Webber and Ian Dury are opposites that are never going to come together.
So I was trying to picture an Ian Dury, Andrew Lloyd Webber collaboration, and how interesting that he thought about it perhaps for a second.
Well, this is my supposition.
Oh, right, and Ben Elton actually did it.
Well, there you
go. What does that tell us?
My point, as they say.
In 1996, Ian Dury was diagnosed as having cancer, so that with hindsight, it looks as if his life was, so to speak, framed between polio and cancer, doesn't it?
Yeah, and he handled it unbelievably well. I think everybody who knew him was amazed at the bravery and, I don't know, the dignity.
He also did some wonderful live performances during that time, and I have such a great memory of seeing him in Victoria Park in Hackney. And I was very worried before I went there, because I thought, is it going to be upsetting? Is he going to look really ill and frail? And of course, what was I thinking? Of course he wasn't. There was no way he was going to be in that sort of state. He was fantastic, and it was a great performance, and it was a wonderful, wonderful day. The illness, it was terrible, but it wasn't what was the most important thing about him. The most important thing about him was his life, not his death.
My thanks to you, Linda Smith, and to Charlie Gillett. If you want to know more about Ian Dury, there's an excellent biography by Richard Balls called Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll. And we'll end with a last Dury song. Linda, your choice, please.
Well, you've played lots of my favourites. I don't have one favourite, but one I'd like to hear now, Blockheads, because I just love the lyrics of that particularly. Shoes like dead pigs' noses. That's perfect, isn't it?
That'll look good on the paper, won't it?
We'll have that one Smithfield.
Ian Dury, Linda Smith's choice for Great Lives back in 2003. It was presented by Humphrey Carpenter and produced by Mark Smalley.